If you should go to Ireland, a place you'll never know, the dear old land's completely changed from days of long ago. The fine old Irish families who made the country grand.
Thanks, Madeline, for that introduction, and thank you to the Vancouver Historical Society for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm really glad to be here. And as Michael started, I want to recognize too that I'm speaking to you tonight on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which is land that I also occupy as a settler. And as Michael also said, the land where we're specifically meeting tonight has been the site of a village for thousands of years, and then the Kitsilano or Squamish Reserve from the late 19th century to its forced surrender in the early 20th. And the content of my talk tonight is inextricably linked with that particular history, with the colonial processes by which settlers have come to this territory really recently, and at the same time come to ignore a much longer Indigenous history and sovereignty and home here. And I'm sometimes going to speak explicitly about that and sometimes not, but it remains at the core of the history I'm talking about. So more specifically, the stories I'm going to tell you tonight orbit around this man, Samuel Greer. Pictured here in the early 1920s, near the end of his life, Greer was an Irish settler who spent most of his rather colorful adulthood in British Columbia. In some circles, and especially Vancouver history circles, Greer is the stuff of legend. I've been working on a larger research project on Greer for a while now, and I've become really interested in the Greer family, not just Sam Greer. And I've been interested in them beyond the limits of this city. But most often when we talk about Sam Greer, we're talking about Sam Greer in relation to what's been dubbed his battle for Kitsilano, a local saga entangled in the foundations of Vancouver. So at the same time as the Canadian Pacific Railway Company was completing the Transcontinental Railway to this place, its Pacific terminus, and establishing the foundations of Vancouver in the 1880s, Samuel Greer was locked in intransigent war with the company over their competing claims to the same plot of land, a stretch of land just along the water right next door to here. And I'm going to start tonight with this better known story before I dig into what I promised you, which is the untold story. So here's a map looking at this part of the land from across English Bay around 1889. The red arrow there points very roughly to where we are, which was then the Squamish Kitsilano Reserve. And to the left of that, it was the predecessor to the Burrard Street Bridge. And to the right, the west, and just off the screen, is the land at the heart of Greer's so-called battle, centered on what's currently called Kitsilano Beach, but what was in the late 19th century called by most settlers Greer's Beach. And while the beach was commonly called Greer's Beach, the question at the heart of the battle for Kitsilano was precisely that. Was it his? Now, the Indigenous laws of this land, as well as British colonial and Canadian law, tell us that definitively it wasn't his. Like all of the region, it hadn't been lost or surrendered or sold or otherwise ceded to the crown by the Indigenous nations whose territory it was. But for Greer and his opponents, that wasn't the concern. Rather, the knotted question at the heart of this battle was, did Greer have legal title to this property, or did the CPR? Now, to help explain the broad contours of this complicated conflict and how it played out, I thought I'd start tonight by outlining a short tour that you could take from the museum after my talk tonight if you want to stretch your legs. I'm calling it a tour to remember Greer from the Museum of Vancouver. So we're here. And from here, you can head out the parking lot, and you can start by traveling along the edges of what was called Greer's Point to the place at the heart of the conflict, Kit's Beach or Greer's Beach. There we go. So this is a place that Greer claimed was a piece of property, neighboring the reserve and fronting onto the water, and he claimed that he had legally acquired this. His strategies for doing so were multiple, he said. They included buying a preemption from another settler and paying 2 Squamish men in a deal witnessed by the Indian agent. These are controversial claims, and they'd be investigated inconclusively in government commissions and legal cases and editorials and the ever-present court of public opinion in the decades that followed. At the same time, in the 1880s, this land was also included in the enormous land grant given to the Canadian Pacific Railway Company in exchange for completing the line to the end of Burrard Inlet. And this was a grant, 6,000 acres, that formed the core of the city to come. The government insisted there were no squatters with legitimate claims to this granted land. Greer retorted he wasn't a squatter. Neither side backed down. Instead, what ensued and escalated through the 1880s and early 1890s was a dramatic conflict ridden with industrial sabotage, legal cases, media wars, and accusations of stockpiled weapons and political corruption. As Greer and the company took each other to court over and over again, the Greer family continued to occupy the land. Right around where I've stopped us on the tour here, early in what I think would become a tradition of inadequate, tiny Vancouver housing, a large family in a 450 square foot house located right here at the beach. Meanwhile, the CPR built a spur rail line right up to the Greer's fence. In retaliation, Greer went out at night and he cut the CPR telegraph lines. The company took him to court for this, and he testified in court that if the lines were put back up again, he would, quote, remove them again. Amazingly, the case was dismissed. This is really typical of Greer. The CPR then sent men to start boring for coal on the land. Greer took a shovel and started filling in the holes with the men still inside. There is story after story like this. This is framed by many settlers as a war between the little guy, a plucky pioneer, so-called gritty Greer, up against the big bad company monopoly in league with a corrupt government. However you frame it, the war reached its infamous climax at the place where we paused at the beach, just off screen to the west of this image, on the 26th of September, 1891. On that morning, Deputy Sheriff Tom Armstrong, along with 4 other police officers, boarded a CPR engine accompanied by what the Vancouver Daily World newspaper would call, quote, a gang of men in a boxcar. They were sent by the railway company. The men were armed with a court order that said this land was railway land, and they intended to enforce it by evicting Greer and his family. Now remember, the company built a rail line right up to the fence, so this engine and boxcar could pull right up to the Greer's property, right in front of their house. And according to the stories, as the train pulled up with the police on board, Greer spotted it coming and he turned and he ran to the house. And he barred himself inside the house with his wife, Louisa Johnson Greer, and their children. According to the stories, Armstrong reached the door, by drama, and he called out, they say, open this door, Greer. And then Greer shouted back something to the effect of, go away from there or I'll make it hot for you. Opinions differ on the intentions with which the next events happened, but we do know this. Next, there was a shotgun blast from inside the house. The thick wooden door slowed the number 6 shot, but about 5 shots buried themselves in the deputy sheriff's left cheek, others in his coat and the leather pocketbook over his chest, and he lost some buttons. According to one of the constables there, Armstrong then yelled, "My God, boys, I'm shot." Although he presented what the newspaper called a pitiful sight, he was ultimately not seriously wounded. Nonetheless, the officers hightailed it back to the train and beat a hasty retreat to the city. On the way, they met with the sheriff, Armstrong's father, not coincidentally, I'm sure, and got a warrant for Greer's arrest on a charge of attempted murder. Then they all loaded back up onto the train again, happy family, this time accompanied by the press and the public who gathered to witness the unfolding spectacle at the beach. And again, stories vary on what happened next. Depending on who you want to believe, Greer had used this break to barricade the door with several trunks and mounted 5 loaded guns on top. Or Greer agreed to go with the police peacefully, calmly smoking a cigar while they read him the warrant. In any case, the police removed him from the land and took him to lockup, where he continued to maintain it had been an accidental shooting. Meanwhile, back at the beach, his wife, Louisa Johnson Greer, refused to leave. She occupied the house. The men started loading the furniture from the house onto the train, and she went out and she unloaded it. And then, in what I like to think about as the feminist resistance for the ages, she insisted that the men round up the fowl, milk the cow, do all of the other farm and domestic chores that needed doing. Finally, unwilling to delay any longer and using what the newspaper called gentle force, the police removed her too from the land. And as she walked away, the men set fire to her house and the other buildings. The fire raged through the night, visible from here, from downtown. And the next day, with Sam Greer still in jail awaiting trial, 500 people came out from Vancouver to gawk at the ashes of the family farm at Greer's Beach. Now, of course, Greer's battle with the CPR neither began nor ended with the shooting of Deputy Sheriff Armstrong. Rather, this moment was the climax of a much longer war. And even after that night, much more of that war remained to be fought. In a dramatic and rather questionable trial, Greer would be convicted of the shooting, although the charge was downgraded from attempted murder. However, then other settlers, particularly his fellow Orangemen, would rally to his cause, calling for a pardon. And indeed, his sentence would be remitted and he would be released early. Greer and his family would never return to live on the land at the beach in the long term. He'd never get proof of legal title. But he continued to fight the case insistently and often creatively until his death in the mid-1920s. But even then, the story didn't die with Sam Greer. Rather, others took up the cause, probably none more so than Major James "SKITT" Matthews, first archivist of Vancouver and what I would call a Greer enthusiast/collector. He's shown here with his family. Now, Matthews' research for his volumes on early Vancouver full of stories of Greer, some true and some definitively fictional legend. And they're full of this because Matthews asked people over and over again what they thought about Greer. And I love Matthews' materials in the archives because he commented on people's stories. So when people told stories about Greer that he didn't like, he would write in the margins, "Rot." The archive is not unbiased. But either way, Greer looms large there, larger than life, in the text of early Vancouver and in the archive that Matthews helped to build. And I think it's Matthews, it's others, but maybe especially Matthews, that help to make Greer the legend he is. He's not the most famous Vancouverite, but he continues to be commemorated all around us today. So I'm going to return us to this tour. I'm not just abandoning you at Kitts Beach, I promise. So once you leave the old Greer homestead, you can walk along the old rail route and then southeast to about here. And that's where you'll find Sam Greer Place. This is a housing cooperative established in 1977 and named after Greer as somebody who, quote, fought for housing rights. Certainly his own, right? And from there, you can leave Sam Greer Place and you can come back to about here. And this is where you'll find Vera's Burger Shack. That was not an endorsement, not a paid advertisement. But rather here, I gather you can have one of these, a lager or a pale ale from Greer's Beach Brewery. In the company's words, the brewery, quote, celebrates Greer's bold, pioneering spirit with 2 brazen beers steeped in the area's tradition, as unruly and fun-loving as Kit's Beach's present-day denizens. From Vera's, you can walk back to the museum. You can walk back along a road named for Greer, Greer Avenue. Although Greer never gained proof of legal title, and even as his name was replaced from the beach and the point, as place names so often are, this small road here continues to claim a kind of place and belonging for Greer in this neighborhood. But as you walk this route back to the museum, I want you to think too about how these commemorations celebrate some things and erase others. In these examples, Greer's been commemorated as representative of positive values, supposedly associated with this place. Somehow at the foundations of Kitsilano and Vancouver, we find the gritty, the bold, the righteous. This framing celebrates his fight for property and his battle against dispossession, while skimming over the underlying battle over land and dispossession here. Because this tiny Greer Avenue leads you back here, the site of the forcibly surrendered Squamish Reserve, and an ancient village site that long predated his claims. A battle that, even more so than Greer's fight, underpins the history of this city. So in this sense, the point of my little tour that I've started with is this. Samuel Greer's battle for Kitsilano is embedded in this land and its history, and it's being commemorated all around us. And it's rich and it's significant. It's a story that even on its own reveals the complex colonial history of possession and property and dispossession that's been woven into this city from its late 19th century beginnings. But that, I think, is the expected story for me to tell you tonight. Tonight, I promised you, though, an untold story about Sam Greer. And so with the remainder of my time, I want to rethink this battle for Kitsilano in a different way. I want to do it by rewinding and telling you what predated his Kit's Beach War, putting this hyper-local story into a larger context through some other stories about the Greer's family that you won't really see celebrated in co-ops or ales or street names. And in choosing these stories to tell you, I've got a couple of main intentions here. One is this. To the extent that we've talked about the Greers at all, we focused on it as almost exclusively a Vancouver story. And it is, in part. But if we follow the Greer family in their longer story, we get something different. We see that the battle for Kitsilano is simultaneously at the foundations of Vancouver and a product of a much wider set of lessons and actions and strategies and ideas for the Greers. Vancouver wasn't established in isolation from what came before, and it wasn't established in isolation from what came elsewhere. And second, and I faded him here very intentionally, I'm struck that when we talk about Sam Greer, we talk about Sam Greer. And the women and the children in his family have been rendered largely invisible or backdrops in a scene that focuses on him and the men he fought. So I'm going to make him fade a little bit in significance tonight and take seriously the women and children whose lives intersected with his but weren't reduced to his. And again, I think this opens up a different set of questions and a different perspective on this war. My overall point is this. What happened at Kit's Beach neither started nor stayed at Kit's Beach. Rather, it came to be and only makes sense in a larger familial and colonial context, where Sam Greer forged a pattern of actions that he'd bring to bear against the CPR, but in a longer history had profoundly uneven consequences for him and the people in his life. So to tell you about this, I'm going to take you on another tour, but this time it's hemispheric. It's not what you can do tonight. I got to start outside of Vancouver. Not just outside of Vancouver, but half a world away from it. So Sam Greer was born in Innisfresh, North Ireland, sometime around 1843. In his teens, he moved to North America. American Civil War broke out shortly after his arrival. I like to joke that knowing what comes from Greer later, that might not have been coincidence. But nonetheless, he enlisted on the Union side, and he served in the Navy for 364 days before being shot in the leg. Not a severe injury, but one that nonetheless garnered him a special stocking and a healthy pension until his death, and then for his wife afterwards. From the war, he moved north to Quebec, where he ran a tavern in the township of Havelock, close to the American border. There, he also met and married the 17-year-old Sarah FRIAR. Within a year, Sarah FRIAR Greer gave birth to her first child, a daughter, Eliza Jane. And then Sam and Sarah, perhaps together, perhaps one after another, left Quebec. Their infant Eliza Jane stayed behind with FRIAR's parents as they moved. They perhaps ran a tavern in Montana, kept a boarding house in California, and certainly on Sarah's part, gave birth to another child, Frederick or Freddie. In 1868, the three of them, Sam, Sarah, and Freddie, moved north to British Columbia. And at this point, the mainland of British Columbia was a decade-old British colony, struggling in a waning gold rush, teetering on the brink of financial collapse, desperately seeking long-term white settlers to farm and just maybe to help impose British law, order, society, and culture in order to tame an indigenous space into something more colonial. The Greer family story gives us some insight into how this kind of colonial project worked or didn't in the years before Sam became embroiled in the conflict in Vancouver. So when they first arrived in British Columbia, they set up in Chilliwack. Let's see if I can do this. Right around here. Yeah, we're over here. They set up in Chilliwack, then a nascent settler community on Stalo territory in the Fraser Valley. Sam Greer was appointed special constable in the district and quickly kicked off some heated and extended conflict with other settlers, and especially Stalo people, primarily over land. Trevor Williams has outlined this conflict in a recent British Columbia History magazine article, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much here tonight. But I will say this. Greer's conflict over land in Chilliwack absolutely did serve as a key predecessor and a significant lesson in the techniques of dispossession and land claims that he would bring to bear on the CPR battle to come. And his conflict in Stalo territory also revealed his willingness and his capacity to use physical violence to get his way, and the uneven consequences of that. It included, for example, a brutal physical assault on a Stalo man, after which he tried to use his police powers to charge that man with assaulting him. When he took the man to court, however, the justice noted that the accused was bloodied and beaten, and Greer appeared to be absolutely fine. When Greer admitted to the assault, the case was dismissed, although Greer was never charged in return. And I think this marks the beginning of one of those lessons for Greer. Be litigious, always. In this case, and in many others over the decades that followed, he was defined over and over again that even if he didn't actually win a legal case, he didn't lose a terrific amount either. And so Greer charged and sued frequently. This violence, though, would echo in more tragic and chilling ways for Stalo and for Greer's family in the months that followed that case. And this is one story where I want to dwell a little bit tonight. So shortly after that assault charge was rejected, Greer lost his position as special constable and moved to the Cariboo, where he'd try his hands in the gold fields. Sarah FRIAR Greer, their toddler son Freddie, and his 6-month-old daughter remained in their Chilliwack home. In mid-June 1870, Sarah FRIAR Greer later said, "She took Freddie to pick berries outside, leaving her daughter behind to nap in her bed. When she returned, the baby was dead, murdered." I'm interested in this story for several reasons, but most of all because of this. The archive is far from thorough and clear in its explanation of the case. I don't even know the baby's name, and I certainly don't know who killed her. Rather, the existing records reveal both the power of the prevailing ideas and assumptions and their limits. One thing is clear. Both the police and the settler press were immediately certain. The murder must have been a consequence of Greer's long-term dispute with Stallo and probably revenge for his violence. In the minds of these settlers in colonial British Columbia, Indigenous people were immediately, seemingly logically, under suspicion. I don't have any evidence that anyone else was ever investigated. And we can see this assumption at play already in the first newspaper mention of the case. On the 22nd of June, 1870, the Mainland Guardian reported on what it called the cruel murder, in which extreme violence had been used. 3 Indians were taken into custody on suspicion, the newspaper reported. But the evidence was not sufficient to fix the guilt upon 2 of them. The third, a boy of about 12 years of age, is detained in custody, as there are strong reasons for believing that he's at least privy to the murder, and it is hoped that further evidence will be forthcoming. 3 days later, the Guardian reported again that the police were now pursuing yet another Indigenous man who, it said, since the time of the murder had been reportedly concealed in the woods near the scene of the crime. The authorities, the paper claimed, have every reason to believe the man is guilty of this cruel murder. The story was then picked up by Victoria's British colonists the following day with just one sentence in the middle of a paragraph listing mainland news. I quote, "The police are on track of the murderer of the infant at Chilliwack." Here, the Victoria paper did not just suspect, it presumed guilt. These media conclusions are both revealing and unsurprising for me. We know that in 1870, white settler society and its policing and legal systems were deeply and obviously racist against Indigenous people. Given Greer's widely known and condemned violence against Stallo, it's perhaps even less surprising that the newspapers and apparently also the police assumed it must have been revenge. The following week, the Cariboo Sentinel finally reported on the story. The Express had finally arrived and brought the news to Sam Greer, the baby's father there. And in this article, the Sentinel indicated that an arrest had been made and a discovery had been made too that seemingly confirmed the assumptions. It appears that an Indian entertained a grudge against the family, it read, and in revenge stabbed a child in the breast so as to pierce the heart. The Indian was arrested and found in possession of a blood-stained needle. These claims would come under question in the trial that followed the arrest. But for now, the press remained so certain and unwavering in its racialization of guilt. Heard by Supreme Court Justice Henry Crease, the August 1870 trial included detailed evidence from people including Sarah FRIAR Greer, a young Stallo boy who worked in the household, probably the one who'd been detained after the murder, and Sam Greer, returned from the Cariboo for the trial. After their testimony, the jury deliberated and found the accused not guilty. Now, I think it's very possible, even likely, that the accused did not do it. But this finding of an all-white jury in 1870 still surprises me, for some of the reasons I've already intimated. But it's actually what happened next that astounds me the most. Given everything that I know about colonial British Columbia, this should have been a case that erupted in scandal and sensation, if not fear and rage, on the part of other settlers. In the mid-19th century, colonial administrators and commentators expressed significant anxiety about the small number of white settlers in British Columbia and the gendered imbalance in that population. It was a nascent settler society inscribed onto Indigenous territory, predominantly men, wildly outnumbered by Indigenous people. The success of settler British Columbia was imagined to rest on heterosexual, monogamous, reproductive white settler marriage, with a singular importance attached to white babies and white children. literally imagined as the future of British Columbia and these tenuous colonial beginnings. And in this context, I would have thought that this violent act, the murder of a white baby in the colony, would have resonated hard. I would have thought that the murder and the trial would have fueled fears of Indigenous violence against settlers, especially defenseless babies. I would have thought that there would have been outrage, especially after the verdict. At the very least, I would have expected some misogynist blaming of the mother. After all, colonial newspapers didn't exactly shy away from sensation or intimation, and this seems like a story that would have been ripe for it at every turn. But, as far as I can tell, nothing really happened. No other charges were laid, the murder remained officially unresolved, and it seems to have just disappeared from the press. And for me, this silence is revealing if difficult to tease out. I think maybe what we learn is this. In 1870, in British Columbia, race and violence mattered so much. Sam Greer's aggressive brutality towards Stalo over land, the unsolved murder of his baby, the automatic settler accusations against successive Stalo men, and the silence that couldn't really make sense of their own reasonable doubt. Because here the power of colonial violence was also its unpredictability and its uneven consequences. I'm not really sure what Sam Greer learned or lost in this episode, but the archive suggests it wasn't nearly as much as his daughter and his wife and his Stalo hosts and neighbors. In any case, after the trial, Sarah Friar Greer was, records suggest, both traumatized and pregnant again. Given the dates, I think it's probable that her next child, Louisa, was conceived during Sam and Sarah's brief reunion during the trial. Shortly afterwards, Sarah moved north with the children, this time to the Cariboo where Sam had been living. Perhaps predictably, Sam didn't stay there, instead continuing to bounce around, and mostly, I think, back in Chilliwack, continuing to cause trouble. So living mostly in separation from her husband, Sarah Friar Greer set up and made a go of it in the Cariboo. A couple years later, she gave birth to another daughter, Jessie Greer, later claimed to be the first white child born in the Cariboo, although I think this is impossible. But it's Sarah's life in the Cariboo where I want to linger a little bit next. Sam and Sarah Friar Greer had spent most of a decade apart before their informal, partial separation was pushed from quiet community discussion to public scandal. The spark was an incident in Barkerville, just before Christmas 1874. On the 19th of December, Bernard's Express coach brought Sam Greer back to Barkerville. A storm in the making on an otherwise mild and pleasant Saturday. 3 days later, Greer sought out William Burney Cameron in the door of his blacksmith shop, and the two men had what the town's barber, Wellington Delaney Moses, called a dispute. Or, more specifically, according to Cameron's later testimony, Greer, quote, called me a son of a bitch and said, I'm going to cut your heart out. And then he said, you made a whore of my wife, and I will murder you the first chance I get. In the wake of this altercation, Cameron charged Greer with using threatening and violent language. This was not an uncommon type of charge in the Cariboo in this period, where court records are full of similar allegations, including other assault charges involving Greer or Cameron. In this case, 2 other settlers came forward as witnesses, and their testimony largely coincided with Cameron's account, although they also claimed not to have heard the whole exchange. Presumably because of those gaps, Justice of the Peace Jonathan Nutt concluded that Cameron's statement wasn't corroborated and dismissed the case with a warning to the 2 men. This is what I mean by Greer not losing a whole lot in lots of these cases. However, this was far from the end of the Greer trouble in the Cariboo. Continuing the pattern of litigiousness he'd started in Chilliwack and starting a more specific pattern of retributive lawsuits that he would follow for years to come, including in his battle against the CPR, Sam Greer filed a suit against William Cameron for $10,000 for enticing and harboring his wife. And these are torts that were available to a man when he felt that someone had intentionally interfered with his marriage, specifically enticing his wife away from him and harboring her when she had left without his consent. And when Greer sued Cameron for $10,000 here, this symbolized the amount of money that he literally valued his wife for. Incidentally, it's also the same amount of money that he sued the CPR for later. And this was kind of like he figured when he got $10,000 from one of these cases, he'd be good. But. So the case was heard 6 months later in June 1875 by Supreme Court Judge Henry Creese, again, and a jury. A number of Barkerville settlers offered testimony with their impressions of the relationships at the heart of the case, the Greer marriage and the relationship between Sarah Friar Greer and William Bernie Cameron. None of the witnesses contested that Greer and Cameron were in some kind of relationship, and they indicated it had been locally visible. Miner Robert Barr, for example, had stayed with Cameron the previous winter, and he testified that Mrs. Greer slept there a good many times. She left sometimes in the morning, he said, sometimes the same night. Similarly, the barber Moses had seen Mrs. Greer and Cameron together often at Cameron's house, with Mrs. Greer going and coming night, noon, and morning. Even Sam Greer indicated that he'd known about the relationship for 3.5 years. In November 1871, he explained, showed up in Barkerville and put my shoulder to the door and burst it open and found Cameron lying on my bed. What I have written in my notes says, he found Cameron in her bed. In any case, he kicked them out. He stayed around for a while, and then he left again, until that moment in December 1874 when he returned in such a fit of rage. However, while he claimed he tried theoretically to stop their relationship before, he also admitted under cross-examination that he had been, quote, in Cameron's house several times after the trouble, and he would not even swear that he, quote, did not sleep there. Other community members seem to have taken little concrete action to intervene. They, too, had known about this relationship for years, but only Moses reported even having talked with Cameron about it. Otherwise, witnesses suggested instead that the couple had been watched but tolerated rather than ostracized, forming an important part of Barkerville's settler social life, both individually and together. They might have sympathized with Sarah because they blamed Sam for abandoning his wife to what another witness, Annie Jones, called poor circumstances, trying to make a living for herself and 3 children. Certainly, their testimony reflected widespread agreement that it was Sam's responsibility to provide for his family. And since he appeared to have failed in this social and legal duty, then he must take responsibility for the results. Not necessarily condoning the extramarital relationship, the settlers again and again suggested discretion, sympathy, and understanding, situating in the context of an already broken marriage. And I think there's another piece that's important here, too. Sarah Friar Greer's story is exceptional in lots of ways, but it's also not that unusual. There's comparatively few settler women in the Cariboo in this period, but a remarkable percentage of those who were there were living in formal or informal separation from their husbands, either temporarily or permanently. Some of them remarried, others engaged in multiple non-marital relationships, either simultaneously or in succession. And we know lots about these anxious colonial and Dominion efforts to attract white women to British Columbia and encourage their marriages. But we don't talk as much about these really high rates of settler marriage dissolution and what I would call relationship flexibility. In part, it's because most of this kind of relationship strife was negotiated in private, beyond the legal records and public scrutiny that's more likely to appear and include women in the archive. And Sarah Friar Greer here helps us to see that. Her experiences are unusually visible because of her husband's suit against her lover, because he's such a troublemaker, basically. And it helps us to then think about this more typical, or maybe not, I shouldn't call it typical, but more common aspect of settler women's lives in colonial and early provincial British Columbia. The testimony in the case suggests that her life wasn't really that unusual or condemned in Barkerville. And certainly her friends and neighbors felt that she really didn't need to be enticed from such a terrible husband. And the jury leaned this way too. After deliberating for a mere 20 minutes, they returned a verdict for Cameron. However, while Cameron emerged victorious, this case coincided with another set of crises, not unrelated for Sarah FRIAR Greer. Because for several years, in addition to being in a whatever kind of relationship this is with Cameron, she'd been running a successful, if somewhat rowdy, saloon on Jack of Clubs Creek. And she was running it along with a young black woman from Oregon, Annie Jones, also married, living separately from her husband, and living with Greer for a time. Now, this is not an uncommon line of work for settler women in the Cariboo, especially those living apart from husbands. But the consequences of being a businesswoman would prove more severe for Greer. In early June 1875, just 3 weeks before her husband's suit against her lover was heard, she was convicted of selling liquor to Indigenous people. Common charge against settlers who ran drinking establishments in this period, but her punishment was unusually steep, $125 or 6 months in prison. She chose to pay the fine and did so immediately. More seriously, and far less common, was a criminal case against Sarah FRIAR Greer, heard on the 25th of June, just 1 day after her husband's suit was heard. Supreme Court Judge Henry Creese and a jury heard 10 hours of evidence against Sarah FRIAR Greer and Annie Jones before indicting the two women on a charge of keeping a disorderly house. Now, disorderly house could legally mean several things, but Creese would later refer to the case as one of brothel keeping, as would the press. Jones and Greer pled guilty to the charge and were sentenced to 1 year in prison. Again, a sentence that was out of proportion with even the few similar cases that existed. In this period, this was not a moment in a historical context where brothel keeping was subject to police action and legal charges very often, so that was unusual in and of itself. And British Columbian newspapers were gripped by outrage with this sentence. Victoria's Colonist was over the top, and in a scathing editorial declared the sentence the most frightful that we have ever heard of. Barkerville's Cariboo Sentinel claimed a little bit more insider understanding of the case and its context, but agreed that the circumstances were distressing and even, quote, the sternest judge must drop a tear of pity for Sarah, when it was actually, the paper explained, Sam Greer's fault for leaving her, quote, to struggle to obtain bread for herself and her young children. In the midst of this media flurry, Sarah FRIAR Greer and Annie Jones arrived at the Victoria jail, along with Sarah's youngest daughter, the 2-year-old Jessie Greer. In this period, the jail held an average of 40 to 50 people, both convicted and awaiting trial. During their term there, Greer and Jones were usually the only women and probably the only non-Indigenous women. Jessie was deemed too young to separate from her mother, and therefore she was incarcerated as well, the only child included in the jail registers. Sam Greer was left with Freddie and Louisa in the Cariboo, although almost immediately he sent Freddie to school in Cache Creek. Also, almost immediately after this trial, Judge Creese began the unusual process of remitting the sentence that he had literally just passed. Now, this was not an admission of fault on his part, it was his plan all along. More specifically, he wrote, he'd passed a sentence that even he admitted was out of all proportion with other judgments, and regardless of widespread sympathy for the women. But he'd done so because he never intended them to serve the full year. His reasoning was that a long sentence would have to be served in Victoria. A shorter sentence would have allowed them to remain in the Cariboo. And for him, the goal was removing Greer and Jones from the region, for 2 reasons. First, he saw it as a path to their reformation. In his eyes, Greer and Jones had been forced into problematic behavior by their circumstances. And taking them out of what he called the limited community of Barkerville would, he believed, give them the opportunity to escape the bad influences in their lives. And second, Creese argued that their removal would also abate the nuisance, abate the nuisance that they were causing there. what he described as, quote, Indian men and prostitutes under the influence of liquor and assaults and all kinds of immorality publicly exhibited in the streets. And he believed in these two causes so much that he was determined to intervene in their lives and argued that he could and should do so because he was a judge. He could. And particularly in what he called the temporary circumstances of the early provincial period. In the case of Greer and Jones, he proposed to remit their sentences and release them any time after 2 months. What I imagine is what he thought the kind of real sentence was. As long as they gave bonds to the satisfaction of a judge, committed to good behavior in future, and went, quote, to reside among relatives. And it's this last condition, residing among relatives, that would have the largest implications for Greer and Jones, and likely it was intended to. This is because Creese took what he acknowledged to be a very unusual step to ensure it happened. He wrote to their parents. He wrote to Reuben FRIAR, Sarah's father in Quebec, and he wrote to Mrs. Jones, Annie Jones's mother in Oregon. In the letter to FRIAR, he explained that he had convicted FRIAR's daughter of brothel keeping, that her husband had, quote, shamefully neglected and abused her. He mentioned the murder of her baby 5 years earlier, and he said that it had left her, quote, a little affected in the head. He then explained that he wanted to release her from prison, but first he needed the reassurance that she could return to her family. Would he take her back? Now, family is often important, or was understood as important for women leaving marriages or otherwise in trouble in this period. But that kind of safety net was usually missing for settler women in BC who'd often immigrated themselves. And in this case, Greer used the post to recruit distant relatives to do this work. At the same time, he used the family as a means to enact what amounted to deportation for 2 women that he deemed too troublesome to remain in British Columbia. Within a few months, the parents had accepted to bring their daughters back, so the Secretary of State agreed to Creese's proposal to release them early. However, Greer and Jones didn't initially consent to this. These arrangements had been made for them. As the Attorney General explained, quote, both prisoners state that they are prepared to give bonds to be of good behavior, but decline to go to relatives and propose remaining in Victoria. This didn't fly. Officials engaged with the case were determined to run them out of the province. And so in November, 4 months after arriving in jail, twice as long as Creese's imagined sentence, Jones was released from prison, taken immediately to a boat in the Victoria Harbour, and sent back to Oregon. Greer and her daughter remained in the Victoria jail for 2 more months. Finally, her lover, William Bernie Cameron, left Barkerville, and according to a family memoir, albeit one that doesn't mention Greer, traveled to Victoria on snowshoes in the middle of winter, arriving in early January 1876. There, he co-signed her bond. And having met Creese's conditions on the 3rd of January, 29-year-old Sarah FRIAR Greer and her 2-year-old daughter Jessie were released 6 months into the year-long sentence and sent to Quebec. Shortly after Sarah was deported from the province, Sam Greer nipped down to California, where he gained a divorce on the grounds of her so-called desertion. Then he returned to British Columbia, where divorce couldn't quite yet be legally granted. Removed from the province and her marriage, Sarah FRIAR Greer fades from the archives, or at least the archival records I've used so far. Her story is important, though, in its own right in lots of ways, but also, for tonight's purpose, because it provides critical context to her husband's later battle for Kitsilano. She'd been deported by the time Greer claimed land around the corner from here, but she was incarcerated with her young daughter only 15 years before he shot the deputy sheriff and was incarcerated himself. His lawsuit, its testimony, his actions, and the Cariboo more broadly remind us that his tactics and experiences here in Vancouver in the 1880s and 1890s were far from new, even to him, but rather had been carefully honed for years in earlier conflicts, not just over land, but also over family, even as they weren't necessarily winning strategies for him in either context. At the same time, like in the infanticide case in Chilliwack, the consequences of his actions were unequally distributed. And here, Sarah Friar Greer ultimately paid more than either her husband or her lover. Meanwhile, back in British Columbia, less than a year after his divorce, Sam Greer married again, this time to Swedish immigrant Louisa Johnson. He and Louisa settled back in Chilliwack, where his conflicts over land with Stallo and other settlers continued unabated. Eventually, though, he became frustrated. He looked west for a better opportunity, deciding on the land at the beach that would come to bear his name down the road from here, and depending on which sources you believe, moved his family there either in the 1870s or the 1880s. And this, of course, brings us up to the beginnings of the saga that elevated his name to legendary status here. And that, too, is only a beginning. There's so much more that I wish I could tell you here, particularly about the women, who are always overshadowed by Sam Greer's larger-than-life persona, but are perhaps the more interesting. For example, by the time his conflict with the CPR boiled over in the 1890s, his daughter Louisa, conceived around the trial in the wake of her sister's murder, died suddenly in the streets of Vancouver while Christmas shopping with her father. He accused the CPR of causing her death, somehow. Coroner's report found otherwise. Meanwhile, back in Quebec, his two other daughters by his first marriage met for the first time when Jessie was deported there with her mother. By the 1890s, the two of them moved to British Columbia together. In British Columbia, the eldest, Eliza Jane, who'd been left as an infant with her grandparents in Quebec, briefly ended up with the title to Greer's contested Chilliwack claim before it was sold. She married the Vancouver notary public J.Z. Hall before dying soon afterwards. Her sister Jessie, born in the Cariboo, incarcerated and deported as a toddler, returned to British Columbia as an adult, then married her sister's widower and settled in Vancouver in the long term. Jessie Columbia Greer Hall was the family member who most visibly advocated for her father, including visiting him in prison after he shot the deputy sheriff and greeting him at the gates on his early release when he was pardoned. At the same time she advocated for this notorious troublemaker, she was also a well-known Vancouver philanthropist, president of the Hartmacarg Auxiliary, Victorian Order of Nurses, the Native Daughters of BC Post 1, the Burrard Women's Conservation Club, as well as being engaged with the Children's Aid Society, the Vancouver Welfare Federation, the Local Council of Women, etc., etc. As you might expect, there's a lot more to say about Jessie Greer Hall and the making of what I would call a kind of complicated settler respectability in the early 20th century in Vancouver. But for tonight, I can't do that. So for tonight, rather than fast forwarding to talk to you about Jessie Hall, I thought primarily to rewind from the battle for Kitsilano, thinking about what came before the notorious war down the road. And when we put Sam Greer's most famous story into this larger context, considering what came before, and in particular what family life came before, we get a different picture of this event. Yes, the battle for Kitsilano is a story about land and law and colonialism and corruption at the foundations of Vancouver. But it's also a longer and wider story. When we put that Vancouver story in its bigger context, we're reminded that Vancouver didn't come from nowhere and its history isn't just local. It was elsewhere that Greer honed the strategies, legal, extra-legal, highly illegal, emotional, that he would bring to bear against the CPR in the 1880s and 1890s, and then really until his death in the 1920s. And at the same time, we must understand this as part of a larger story about the entangled and unequal consequences of colonial and family violence. And a reminder, too, I think, to think critically about who's been remembered and celebrated and how, and who hasn't. With that, thank you.
Bravo.
Thanks.
I think that this should be either a graphic novel or a motion picture.
You are not the first person to suggest
it's got all the elements of just a blockbuster.
I keep saying that I have started suspecting that someone in the archive is playing a trick on me, where they've just started planting stories to see if I believe them. It's unbelievable.
Oh, you couldn't make this stuff up.
No, I honestly couldn't. Yeah. So, I mean, you did a great job explaining CPR on support here. I will also, the one piece that I will add to that too is Greer's theory. So they absolutely do want to port there. Greer also has a theory that I can prove neither way. So I'll just tell you what he is charging. He also claims that the land on the other side of his property was owned by a land syndicate which included the Premier John Robson. And he claimed that one of the reasons why he never got proof of legal title was that Robson stood to gain a lot of personal money if the CPR line came across. So that's not about what the CPR wants support. But Greer also had this theory that one of the reasons why they were being so intransigent was that there was personal political money at stake in having a line built across that land. So that's the other piece that I will add to that.
Did he just claim the land? Did he just claim it, or did he actually own it?
I don't know. One of the things is that all of the records say wildly different things about that. So he claims that he buys a preemption from another settler, which would have been legitimate. The records are kind of questionable. There's also a forgery commission into whether some of the land records he claims are forged. The paying to Squamish men in a deal signed off by the Indian agent, it was not a legal strategy for acquiring land. And that kicks up a little bit of a fuss with the Department of Indian Affairs, where they get in touch with the Indian agent and they're like, what are you doing? So some of the strategies he claims, ironically actually, and I didn't say this, Greer also in the middle of this tries to become Indian agent of the district. And he writes to the Department of Indian Affairs and he says, I'd make a great Indian agent for this district because I've always had really, really good relations with Indians.
That's like putting Colonel Sanders in charge of your chickens.
Honestly, and you know, one of the things, and this is the other reason why I am unwilling to tell you whether he actually owned it or not, is the archive on this case lies. I'm not going to make a specific accusation as to who, but there are things that are blatantly not true, but it's really hard to disentangle which of those things are not true, and if any of them are true. So I'm leaving it as an open question. Yeah. I have joked before that I feel like he kept the early lawyers in good business. It wasn't prohibitively expensive for him to do so. And I will also say that that pension he got from the American Civil War was decent. But yeah, honestly, I've tried to track the money and I don't really understand how he's doing this. But one of the reasons I will answer not in a material way, but in another way. One of the things that I think allows him to keep doing this is because he never really loses. So I've done this really horrific tally. There are dozens of cases. I didn't even begin to mention the number of times. Like he goes to court over cows, he goes to court over sheep, he goes to court over revenue with the revenue department. He goes to court over a log boom that he finds in the bay here. And I think one of the reasons he does it is because he is willing to take the risks. But I think particularly because he is a white man who is gets people on his side. He's charismatic, and he alienates lots of people, but he's also charismatic. And really, in all of the cases, he just never really seems to lose. He never really seems to win either. But it just seems like nothing really happens. And so I think the costs aren't prohibitive to him, and that's material costs, but it's also social costs. And I think he does it on a scale that other people don't, but I don't think it's super uncommon. They remained officially married, but the wife seems to have been living on her own for much of the time. And he's been hard to track. Major Matthews tried to do this too. He seems to have ended up in the States for a little bit, but he's mostly here. There was a while where he was squatting at the beach again. And I don't know if he's ever living with the daughter or not. I think he's kind of hopping around a little bit. But yeah. Jessie Hall and her husband built a mansion, Killarney, just a little bit further down from that house. I'm sure they chose the location for many reasons, but I kind of like it as we're going to live here now. My father can
and the greatest incongruity is that she was a pillar of the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party was a big supporter of the CPR.
Yeah.
You know, it's just,
so when I say that settlers rallied, when he is convicted and jailed, and I say settlers rallied to his cause, and so there's a petition to get him out of jail, to remit or to pardon him, remit the sentence. And first of all, this is signed by the Victoria City Council, which has absolutely nothing to do with the case. And I think New Westminster City Council signed the petition as well. But I have evidence that I don't understand that Donald Smith, Strathcona of the CPR, also asked for him to be pardoned. So I think that piece has to do with his Orangeman allegiances.
Okay.
And yeah. And
in 1925, in the Stanley Park squatters trial, the only person living there who was able to claim title, they had to claim that she'd lived there for more than 60 years.
Okay.
60. And that was Aunt Sally, the famous Aunt Sally of Stanley Park.
And it might have depended too, I don't know how that applies to if the CPR had legal title. Is it a squatting, would the CPR have had to successfully remove him if it had, anyway, he was only there for decades.
Yeah, and it was a provincial grant.
Yeah.
The CPR's was a provincial grant which trumped anything, that otherwise could have happened.
Yes, he did. So I ran out of room in my tally there. They ended up having a blended family. So the kids that remained in British Columbia from his first marriage blended in with the kids from Louisa Johnson Greer. And so, yeah, they had, don't remember the exact number, but they definitely had further kids after that.
And he would have been just short of 50 when the shooting took place.
That's about right. And he had a half-brother in town as well who also supposedly jumped someone's claim down in South Vancouver. So there's a whole family network that's happening here. I don't think so. He was the Barkerville blacksmith, and coincidentally or not, he was from a township right next door to where Sarah FRIAR grew up, which I don't think Cariboo Cameron was. So I believe they're not related, but also I've been long curious about whether that was a point of connection for them. Mountain View Cemetery. You can go find Greer's grave in Mountain View Cemetery.
It sounds like a field trip. Any more? One or two more questions then, and I think we should wrap it up.
What did I learn about researching women's lives doing this project? I mean, on the one hand, it confirmed things that I already knew, which is that it's really hard. It took me so long to even find Sarah FRIAR's name. The reporting on the Disorderly House case, the media reports never name her. They talk about her as the woman or the unfortunate woman. And so it took me a while to put together those pieces to actually figure out that Case was part of the Greer story. And the other piece of this that I'm really, really interested in is Annie Jones, the young black woman from Oregon who I think was a friend and a business partner or an employee, and she is almost impossible to find. And of course, Annie Jones is a common name, but I think this is also about the intersections of race and gender that makes it really, really challenging to research particularly Black women's lives in colonial British Columbia. And it's not really necessarily surprising, but it's worth saying again and again that it's challenging. But and the other thing I would just say is that they're endlessly surprising. Again, I'm not surprised, but you know, I love Sarah FRIAR. I really do. My struggle to find out anything about her means I've clung to the fact that the jail records tell me she was 5'6", brown hair, blue eyes, and it's the only concrete thing that I have to hold on to other than my kind of imagining of who she was and what she did. So yeah, the gaps.
Is there anybody descended from the Greers here tonight?
Maybe.
So I am a great-granddaughter of Samuel Greer, and his daughter Jessie Greer is my grandmother, who was married to J.Z. Hall, and my father is the son of James Ed Hall and Jessie Greer. So there you go. I'm a descendant of this notorious creature.
And my wife is laying claim to all of Kitsilano.
And I think on that note, we should wrap it up. But I just, Laura, it's fabulous. It was absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you.
And
My name is Deborah Dean, and I am the daughter of James Z. Greer Hall, who is the son of Jessie Columbia Hall, who is the daughter of Samuel Greer. So I am a great-granddaughter of Samuel Greer. Well, what I learned was that he was one of the original pioneers here in British Columbia. And as far as being in Chilliwack, I was actually quite surprised. I didn't know that about him, that he lived in Chilliwack. I only heard about him in regards to having gone to the Cariboo, because that's where my grandmother, Jessie Columbia Greer, was born. And I've always been told that she was the first white child born in the Cariboo. And then the other thing was Kitsilano and Greer's Beach. So that was all I knew. But you know, a lot of this stuff is from her. And I think that she would have had a ton of information about her father, Samuel Greer. And I think it's interesting that she did not hold, I don't feel that she held any hard feelings with regards to the Kitsilano Greer's Beach battle, or whatever we want to call it, because when I saw this picture of her shaking hands with the chief, I don't know where it is in here, this one here, I just think that is priceless. Here she is, and he's wearing a full headdress. I just love this picture, and it says here that Mrs. J.Z. Hall Nee Greer, daughter of the first settler at Greer's Beach, now Kitsilano Beach, renew old acquaintanceship on the 22nd of August 1945 on the ceremonial return to Vancouver of CPR locomotive number 374, which drew the first passenger train from Montreal to Vancouver on the 23rd of May 1887. So she was actually a reconciliation. This was a reconciliation going on here. She had no hard feelings towards all of that, and I just see that as being a real positive outcome. I just think it's fascinating that there's a Greer Avenue, and people sort of know of Greer's Beach, but it's all called Kitsilano now. Well, that was his name. That was the chief's name, was Kitsilano, or however you pronounce it. But the other thing that I found interesting was in some of the things that were given to me from the estate that I received was this discharge paper of Samuel Greer. Now this is a certificate of discharge from the I guess it's from the Navy Department, the Bureau of Navigation from the United States, that shows that he was actually a second-class fireman on a boat that was conscripted to serve in the American Civil War. And Samuel Greer was on that. He fought in that, and he was wounded. I just thought whoa, what is this? Like, does this mean anything to me? Like, do I need this piece of document? And yet, here it is. And then when I looked it up on the internet, there was the picture of the boat, and I went, oh my goodness, this is really good. This is history. You know, it's history, and it's fun. I'm enjoying it. It's fun. I'm not going to get crazy about it, but I'm having fun with this and enjoying it, and I want to pass it on to my children and my grandchildren so that they have an appreciation. My father, James Ed Greer Hall, the son of James Ed Hall, was her last child, and there was a 12-year gap between him and the youngest daughter. There were 4 daughters. And so, interestingly enough, Jessie Greer had wanted a granddaughter, and she died in 1949. No granddaughters, lots of grandsons. And I was born in 1952. She never saw me, and I never saw her. And I just think that if she knew today how many well, I guess I'm the only granddaughter, but how many great-granddaughters and great-great-granddaughters she has now. It's quite interesting. She would have been, I think, very happy.
If you should go to Ireland, a place you'll never know, the dear old land's completely changed from days of long ago. The fine old Irish families who made the country grand, they all have sailed across the sea to rule in Yankee land. In Ireland, yeah, the old place isn't like it was before. They cheered the king and then salute him. Regular Irishmen would shoot him. Ireland isn't Ireland anymore. The Sullivans and Croker too are men of Irish birth. Their fighting fathers tried to wipe out England off the earth. But now King Ed is Croker's pal since Nick left Tammany. And soon King Ed will have the nerve to visit Big Timdy. In Ireland, yeah, the old place isn't like it was before. When you see men like Richard Coker playing the King of England poker, Ireland isn't Ireland anymore. The land is filled with foreigners, of that I have the proof. A Russian wrestler's training now on Blarney Castle's roof. His trainer's name is Goldenberg. He did an awful thing. He went and took the Blarney stone to wear it in a ring. In Ireland, oh my, yeah, the old place isn't like it was before. Since Hacken Smith went up to wrestle upon the roof of Blarney Castle, Ireland isn't Ireland anymore. There's no more pigs in Ireland from Dublin up to Cork. It's getting so that no one there will eat a piece of pork. And up around Killarney there's a man named Izzy Cohen. He's bottling up Killarney's lakes to sell them for cologne. In Ireland, ha ha! Yeah, the old place isn't like it was before. They call the babies Hans and Herman. Everyone there is talking German. Ireland isn't Ireland anymore. In years gone by, old Erin was a land of fighting men. They had no Dago runners or no coloured champions then. John L. and Sharky both are old, you must admit they are. We have no Irish champion now but poor old Peter Marr. In Ireland, well, poor Peter. Yeah, the old place isn't like it was before. When old John L. was young at puncheon, he'd lick them all before his luncheon. Ireland isn't Ireland anymore.